a quiet park bench, a young black woman reading in peace, until a racist cop lifts her skirt with his baton, laughing as if no one would stop him. But what he didn't know? She's the mayor's daughter, and the storm she unleashes will expose every crack in his power. Stay to see how it ends. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun filtered through the moss-draped oaks of Lakeview Park, casting long shadows across the walking trail and still water beyond. It was the kind of quiet only a southern Sunday could bring, golden and slow, where even the breeze moved gently through the leaves. On a weathered bench by the curve of the path, a young woman sat alone, her presence almost blending into the stillness. Her name was Nia Brooks. She was 26 years old, dressed simply in a navy cotton skirt that brushed her ankles and a soft cardigan draped across her shoulders. Natural curls pinned loosely behind her ears framed her face as she flipped the worn pages of a second-hand paperback resting in her lap. To a stranger, she might have seemed like anyone else, just a young woman stealing a moment of quiet. But beneath the quiet exterior was a story few could see. Nia wasn't a stranger in this part of town. She'd grown up just 2 blocks away. She knew the names of the street vendors, the rhythms of the neighborhood kids' laughter, and the way the park smelled after an early spring rain. She was the only daughter of Mayor Helen Brooks, the city's most powerful leader and the fiercest advocate for justice. But on this Sunday afternoon, Nia wasn't the mayor's daughter. She was just herself. No security detail, no campaign pins, no political armor. Just a woman reading alone in the sun. It wasn't unusual for Nia to come here alone. She valued these moments, where she could disappear into a story and escape the noise of headlines and politics. But peace, as she would learn again today, was fragile. The crunch of gravel behind her shattered the stillness, like a glass falling from a table. Footsteps, heavy, slow, too deliberate to be casual, the kind of steps that carried arrogance, not caution. Nia paused, lowering her book but not yet turning around. She knew those kinds of footsteps. She'd heard them in press briefings, in city council debates, in the halls of institutions where power wore a uniform. "Nice skirt," a voice called out, thick with sarcasm. Male, mid-30s, white. "Bet it looks better from the inside." Nia exhaled quietly, tucking her book to the side. She turned slowly, calmly, meeting the gaze of 2 uniformed officers standing just feet away. The older one stood with a wide jaw and a gut that strained against his belt. His name tag read Lasky. The younger one, leaner and tense, looked like he hadn't been on the force long. His tag read Carter. Where Lasky's grin oozed condescension, Carter's expression hovered between amusement and unease. "Can I help you?" Nia asked, voice steady, measured, not defiant, but not submissive either. Lasky chuckled, stepping forward with the swagger of a man who expected no consequences. "Doing our rounds, sweetheart. Sunday patrol. You know how it is." But Nia knew exactly how it was. And she knew this wasn't just a patrol. Nia glanced around the park. The joggers had disappeared down the far path. The children by the playground were too far to notice. In this moment, on this stretch of trail, she was alone. "Well, I'm just sitting," she replied evenly. "Reading. Nothing illegal about that. Last I checked." "Dependence," Lasky smirked. He took another step closer, boots grinding against the gravel. "You got any ID on you? Could be loitering, or maybe casing the place." "Casing a public park?" Nia raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth tightening. "Seriously?" Carter shifted uncomfortably beside him, but didn't speak. Lasky, meanwhile, didn't break stride. He'd played this game before. Harass, intimidity, get compliance through discomfort. "You got an attitude, huh?" Lasky sneered. "Always a shame when the pretty ones turn out to be mouthy." He tilted his head, grin widening like a shark circling prey. "Maybe we just need to check for contraband. You wouldn't mind a little search, right?" And before the full weight of the sentence could settle, Before the fear in Nia's chest could fully rise, he acted. One sharp movement. Practiced. Quick, the baton snapped from his side, and with a casual flick of his wrist, he lifted the hem of her skirt. For a second, just a second, the fabric flew up, exposing her thigh to the cold, open air. Time fractured. The sun still shone, the breeze still blew, but everything else shattered. Nia gasped, her hands shooting down to yank the skirt back into place, her heart hammering against her ribs, her face flushed, not with shame, but with fury. Lasky laughed, a low, ugly laugh that filled the empty space like smoke. Carter barked out a single nervous chuckle, then looked away, his face paling beneath the late afternoon sun. "The hell is wrong with you?" Nia's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and clear, echoing through the stillness. "You just assaulted me." "Assault?" Lasky tilted his head, as if the word amused him. "Please, lighten up. Just having a little fun. It's Sunday, ain't it?" But there was no humor in the air now, only the slow, suffocating weight of violation. Nia's hands trembled, but her spine stayed straight. Her mother had always told her, "Don't let them steal your dignity, even when they try to take everything else." "You think this is a joke?" she asked, voice low but steady. "You think you can do this to anyone you want?" Lasky's smirk deepened, cruel and confident. "E1, just girls like you." And with that, the afternoon broke wide open. For a moment, everything in Nia froze. The fear, the rage, the shame, all tangled together, fighting for space in her chest. But deeper than the fear was something older, stronger, something her mother had taught her since she could speak. Do not let their power define you. Nia straightened her back. She met Lasky's eyes with a calm that felt like armor. "Tell me your badge number," she said, voice quiet but firm. Lasky laughed, shaking his head like she was some naive college kid playing activist for the afternoon. "Oh, we got ourselves a little rebel, huh?" His grin widened. "What you gonna do, sweetheart? Call Channel 7? Get me cancelled?" But Nia wasn't bluffing, and something in her stillness made him pause, if only for a second. Carter glanced between them, nervous now. He tugged at his collar, sweat starting to bead on his temple. This wasn't the harmless flirtation or power trip he thought it might be. This was something else, something bigger. Lasky didn't see it yet, but Carter did. "I said," Nia repeated, slower this time like a command, "tell me your badge number." Lasky crossed his arms over his chest. His baton dangled loosely from his right hand. "You're in no position to make demands," he sneered. But in truth, the balance had already shifted. He just didn't feel it yet. Nia slipped her hand into her bag, calm, controlled. No sudden moves. Her fingers closed around her phone. Carter shifted again. Something about her composure, her steadiness. It didn't match the narrative he had been told about women like her. "Ray, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Dean," Lasky snapped, not breaking his gaze from Nia's face. But Carter's hesitation was too late to hide. Doubt had entered the equation. And once doubt enters, control is never absolute again. Nia unlocked her phone with a single swipe. Her thumb hovered over her favorites list, landing on one name. One tap. She lifted the phone to her ear, and with a calm that cut sharper than any scream, she spoke 5 words that neither officer was prepared for. "Mom, I need you here." Lasky's face froze for the first time. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was the first crack in his arrogance. The kind of crack that, given time, splits a whole foundation apart. And as the wind stirred the trees around them, carrying away the last traces of the peaceful afternoon, Nia sat tall on the bench, phone against her ear, and waited for the reckoning to begin. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. Nia held the phone steady against her ear, her pulse loud but her hands calm. This wasn't the first time she had faced down power, but it was the first time that power had tried to strip her dignity in plain daylight. The line rang once, twice, and then connected with a familiar voice that spoke like a blade wrapped in silk. "Nina, what's wrong?" Nia's voice didn't shake. She kept it simple, surgical. Her mother didn't need emotion. She needed facts. Redview Park. 2 officers approached me. One lifted my skirt with a baton. Name tags say Lasky and Carter. There was a pause. Not hesitation, but calculation. On the other end of the line, Mayor Helen Brooks closed the file she'd been reading and stood from her kitchen table. She spoke with a cold, clear intensity. "Are you safe?" "Now," Nia answered, scanning the quiet path. "But it's escalating." "Stay put. Do not leave. Do not engage further. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Keep the line open." Nia breathed, steadying her heartbeat. "Understood." Helen didn't waste another word. As she ended the call, her hands were already moving. She dialed Deputy Chief Lorraine Vega before grabbing her car keys. Vega answered on the first ring, voice crisp, already sensing the weight of the moment. "Lorraine," Helen said, slipping into command mode, "I need you at Lakeview Park immediately. Officers Raymond Lasky and Dean Carter are harassing a civilian. That civilian is my daughter. Lasky just assaulted her with his baton. I want them suspended on site. Bring IA forms and a city attorney." "Understood, Mayor," Vega replied without missing a beat. "I'll mobilize internal affairs and secure the area. ETA 7 minutes." Helen hung up and slid her phone into her jacket pocket. No press, no security detail, no staged optics. Just a mother walking into battle. Back at the park, the tension hung thick in the air. Lasky crossed his arms and smirked like a man who had played this game 100 times and never lost. "Look at this," he drawled, gesturing toward Nia with an exaggerated shrug. "Calling mommy to save her. How cute." Nia didn't respond. She kept her phone close, open line buzzing softly against her ear. Carter shifted uneasily beside him, pulling out his phone and thumbing quickly through a search bar. Something about this wasn't adding up. His rookie gut told him they weren't harassing some random girl. He glanced at Laskaya, then back at Nia, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "What's your last name?" Carter asked, almost against his better judgment. Nia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was already on its way, riding on the wheels of 2 black SUVs cutting through downtown traffic. And in that moment, under the golden southern sky, the balance of power began to tremble. Carter's fingers trembled slightly as he typed. He searched Nia Brooks and Lakeview Park, half hoping nothing would come up, but within seconds, the results appeared like floodlights in the dark. Images of Mayor Helen Brooks filled the screen. Press conferences, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, justice reform panels, and beside her, a younger woman. Same curls, same calm eyes. His stomach dropped. "Ray," Carter whispered urgently, holding up the phone. "I think she's telling the truth." Lasky waved him off, annoyance flashing across his face. "I said drop it, Dean. Just another girl playing games. Don't let her mess with your head." But Carter couldn't drop it. Not now. He could feel it, the invisible line they'd just crossed. This wasn't a minor intimidation anymore. This was a career-entering mistake waiting to explode. A few yards away, near the playground, a teenage boy paused his game of catch. He noticed the tension in the air, the way Niata sat still but strong, the way the officers loomed over her. Without drawing attention, he pulled out his phone and hit record. The first 30 seconds of a video that would soon travel farther than anyone standing there could imagine. On the far edge of the park, an older man on a morning walk slowed down, squinting through his glasses. He saw the uniform, the body language, the forced smiles. He knew trouble when he saw it, and this smelled like trouble. And then came the sound. 2 low rumbles, almost like thunder rolling across the pavement. Tires on gravel, engines humming with purpose. Black SUVs, sleek and unmarked, rolled into the park's entrance with calm authority. They didn't speed, didn't flash lights, but their arrival was a statement in itself. Doors swung open in near unison. From the first SUV, Mayor Helen Brooks stepped out. No polished press outfit, no formal heels, just dark jeans, a simple blouse, and a face carved from stone. Behind her, Deputy Chief Lorraine Vega exited the second vehicle, clipboard in hand, her badge already displayed. The park seemed to hush as they approached. Helen's steps were steady, direct. She didn't run, didn't shout. She simply walked toward her daughter, gaze locked on the two officers standing before her. Carter took a step back, instinctively straightening his posture. Laska's smirk faltered but didn't fall completely. He wasn't ready to admit what was happening. "Reserve," Helen said, voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "Names and badge numbers now." Carter swallowed hard. "Dean Carter, badge 6042. Helen's eyes shifted to Lasky. He hesitated, for the first time truly hesitated. "Raymond Lasky, badge 5189. Helen nodded once, already pulling out her phone again. "Effective immediately. You are both relieved of duty pending internal affairs investigation. Chief Vega will take it from here." The air snapped cold and electric. What had begun as harassment was now a public reckoning. Lasky crossed his arms, trying to hold onto some shred of authority, but it was slipping fast. He forced a laugh, sharp and bitter. "You don't have the authority to suspend me, Mayor. This is police business. Stay in your lane." Helen didn't even blink. Her voice remained level, cutting deeper than any yell. "This city is my lane, and I will not allow abuse of authority under my watch." Deputy Chief Vega stepped forward, her clipboard steady in her hands. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't playing. "Per city policy and departmental code, I have the authority to place you both on immediate emissary leave pending investigation into misconduct. This action is within the scope of my office and effective as of this moment." She handed each officer a sealed envelope, the kind that only ever brought trouble. "Your suspension notices. Hand over your weapons, badges, and duty belts." For a long, stretched second, no one moved. Then Carter, pale and sweating, unclipped his badge and sidearm without a word. His hands shook as he placed them gently into Vega's evidence bag. His silence was almost louder than the confrontation itself. Lasky held out longer, jaw tight, breathing heavy. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he yanked his belt loose and slammed it into Vega's waiting hands. "This is a joke," he muttered, voice low and venomous. "You're throwing me to the wolves." "No, Officer Laska," Vega said, without a flicker of sympathy. "You threw yourself there." By now, the quiet witnesses had turned into a small but growing crowd. Parkgoers, joggers, and Sunday strollers gathered at a respectful distance, phones held steady. Some had caught the initial confrontation. Others were piecing it together, from the faces, the body language, the sheer weight of the moment. Nia remained seated on the bench, phone still by her side, her back straight, her face calm. She didn't need to speak. Everything about her presence spoke louder than words. Helen turned to her daughter, her voice softening just slightly. "Are you okay?" Nia nodded once. "I'm holding together." Helen's hand briefly rested on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity, then returned to business. Vega addressed the crowd without raising her voice. "Thank you to the witnesses who are filming. If you have footage of what happened today, please submit it to Internal Affairs. Transparency is how we protect our community." Lasky's face burned red as the reality settled on him. He was no longer the one in control. The badge that once gave him power now marked him as a defendant. And this was only the beginning. As Helen turned back toward the SUVs, Vega gave the final word. "You'll answer for this, every bit of it." The wind rustled the trees as if to say, "Finally." The moment hung in the air like a wire pulled too tight, and then, as if a signal passed through the wind itself, the quiet edges of the crowd began to shift. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded veteran's cap, stepped forward from the shade of the oak trees. His voice was steady, worn from years of speaking truths no one wanted to hear. "I saw it," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "She was sitting right there, reading. That one," he pointed directly at Laskas, "walked up and flipped her skirt like it was some kind of joke. I was 20 yards away. I saw it clear as day." Lasky's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't dare interrupt a veteran. Not here, not now. Beside him, a young mother clutching her toddler against her hip stepped out from the gathering crowd. Her eyes burned with quiet fury. "He was smirking the whole time," she said, nodding toward Lasky. "Like hurting her was funny. That's not protecting anyone. That's abuse." A murmur swept through the people gathered. Not outrage, yet, but recognition. The kind of recognition that spreads fast when silence breaks. Mayor Brooks turned, letting her gaze sweep across the small but growing assembly. She didn't grandstand. She didn't shout. She simply spoke. "Thank you both for your courage. Your voices matter more than you know." Then she turned back to the officers and made it official. "Officers Raymond Lasky and Dean Carter, as of this moment, you are suspended from active duty, pending an internal affairs investigation into misconduct. Your weapons and badges have already been surrendered. You will report to the department's administrative division within 24 hours for further processing." The crowd stirred, phones lifted higher, fingers tapping across social media apps as the news began its rapid climb into the digital sky. Lasky broke first. "This is ridiculous," he snapped loud enough for everyone to hear. "It was a joke, no harm done. I didn't lay a hand on her." Helen's voice sliced clean through the noise. "You lifted a young woman's skirt with a weapon. You humiliated her in public. That is harm. That is assault. And it will be investigated fully. If your conduct is defensible, the process will show it. If it's not, the consequences will be swift and permanent." For a moment, only the bird song filled the space between them. Lasky glared, but he said nothing more. Even arrogance has its limits when faced with certainty. Carter, standing off to the side, trembled slightly. His gaze found Nia's, and in that brief exchange, something fragile passed between them. He took a step closer, voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry," Carter said, shame thick in his throat. "I knew it was wrong. I should have stopped him." Nia met his eyes. Calm, steady, not cruel. "I know," she said simply. "But you didn't." And that was the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. While the crowd's whispers grew louder, Deputy Chief Lorraine Vega was already on the phone with the Internal Affairs office downtown. Her tone was sharp, professional, and efficient. She ordered an expedited pull of Lasky and Carter's personnel files. No delays, no red tape. This wasn't going to be buried like the others. Within minutes, Vega's team forwarded the first round of findings to her tablet. She scanned the pages, her expression darkening as the list grew longer. Lasky's record wasn't spotted. It was spotted with complaints that never made it past the first level of review. Use of force, inappropriate conduct, harassment. Each entry marked either unsubstantiated or resolved internally. Multiple incidents involve young women of color during so-called routine patrol stop patterns that no one wanted to name until now. Vega's jaw clenched. She had seen these files before, shuffled through bureaucratic processes until they faded from memory. But today, those pages had weight. And today, there was no hiding them. She approached Helen, handing over the tablet with the screen still glowing. Initial review confirms prior complaints, enough to warrant immediate investigative proceedings. Helen took one glance and nodded, her jaw tightening. Open every one of them. I want full reports on my desk by morning. No excuses. Vega said, We'll notify the Civilian Oversight Board tonight." In the distance, the sharp click of camera shutters cut through the quiet, followed by the low hum of approaching news vans. The local media had caught wind of the confrontation. Microphones were already being prepped. Reporters rehearsed their opening lines, ready to spin the story into the evening headlines. Helen turned toward the growing swarm. The park, once a sanctuary of peace, now stood on the verge of becoming a national stage. But she wasn't here for optics. She wasn't here for headlines. She raised one hand to quiet the reporters before they could flood the space. "There will be a formal statement later," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "Right now, my priority is ensuring my daughter's safety and the integrity of this investigation. This is not a spectacle. This is accountability, and we will pursue it fully." The press hesitated, but only for a moment. Then came the first question, sharp and impatient. "Mayor Brooks, is this a personal matter or an official one?" Helen met the reporter's eyes without flinching. "Today it's both, but tomorrow it will be the city's business to answer." And with that she turned away, leaving the reporters scrambling for quotes they didn't expect. Beside her, Vega signaled for the officers to be escorted from the scene. Their humiliation was complete, but their reckoning had only just begun. As the officers were led away by two internal affairs sergeants, the crowd stood still. No cheers, no applause. Just the weight of a truth finally pulled into the light. Lasky kept his chin up, but his eyes darted between the phones recording his every step. He had spent years walking this park with swagger. Today, his steps felt heavier, slower, exposed. Carter, a few paces behind, looked smaller than ever. Shoulders hunched, gaze fixed on the gravel path beneath his boots. For him, shame didn't arrive all at once. It settled like dust, impossible to shake free from. Nia watched them go, her heart pounding quietly beneath her ribs. She hadn't moved from the bench. In that moment, staying still was her power. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would make them see her, unbroken. Mayor Brooks stood beside her daughter, hands clasped calmly in front of her. But anyone who knew her could see the fury simmering beneath her stillness. She turned to Deputy Chief Vega, voice low but clear. "Make sure they're processed by the book. No shortcuts, no cover-ups." Vega gave a single nod. "Understood, Mayor. I've already activated the rapid review panel." Helen exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave her body piece by piece. She glanced back at Nia, her voice softening for the first time since she arrived. "You did exactly what you should have done." Nia gave a faint smile, small but real. "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't shrink." Helen's throat tightened, but she nodded. That was enough. Sometimes, not shrinking was the bravest thing a person could do. As they prepared to leave the park, the media swarm thickened at the trailhead. Reporters from local outlets jostled for position, their microphones extending like weapons in a battle for the first quote. "Mayor Brooks, will the officers face criminal charges?" "Mayor Brooks, is this part of your justice reform platform?" "Mayor Brooks, is your daughter receiving special treatment?" Helen raised a hand, silencing them again. "Daughter is not receiving special treatment. She is receiving the bare minimum protection every citizen of this city deserves. And if what happened today was done to anyone else, I would fight for them just as fiercely. This is not a political moment. This is a human one." With that, she turned to Vega and quietly gave the next directive. "Start pulling Lasky's patrol logs. I want to know every stop he's made in the past 6 months. If there's a pattern, I want it exposed before nightfall." "Yes, ma'am," Vega replied without hesitation. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to end quietly. This was just the first crack in a system about to collapse under the weight of its own lies. The investigation started before dawn. Deputy Chief Vega sat in her office, illuminated only by the glow of her tablet, scrolling through Lascaux's personnel file. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was enraging. Over the past decade, more than a dozen complaints had been filed against him. Most came from young black women. The allegations painted a clear pattern: inappropriate stops, invasive searches, crude remarks, and abuse of authority masked at the room of his. But every single complaint had been dismissed, labeled as unsubstantiated or inconclusive by internal review boards that had protected their own. Buried beneath the official jargon were the real stories. A 17-year-old pulled over on her way home from work. A college student questioned in front of her dorm. A mother stopped while walking her daughter to daycare. Different faces, same fear, same dismissal. Vega's stomach turned as she read through the signatures of supervisors who signed off on the dismissal. Some still wore badges, others had quietly retired. She called in her top investigator, Captain Reyes, and slid the tablet across the desk. "Reopen every single case," she said. "No exceptions." Reyes nodded without hesitation. He knew what was at stake. Meanwhile, across town, Nia sat on the edge of her bed, the morning light casting long shadows across her phone screen. Her inbox had exploded overnight. Texts from friends checking in, emails from civil rights groups offering support, voicemails from strangers sharing their own painful stories. But alongside them came threats. Anonymous messages calling her a liar, an attention seeker, a rape. Some accused her of setting the officers up, as if dignity could be weaponized against power. She scrolled past the worst of them, forcing herself to focus on the messages that mattered. Jordan, her closest friend since childhood, sent a simple text. "You are not alone. Not now. Not ever." She let the tears fall, just for a moment, before pulling herself together. There was no time to fall apart, not yet. By noon, the district attorney summoned Deputy Chief Vega and Mayor Brooks to an emergency meeting at City Hall. The conference room was stark and cold, filled with tension thicker than the morning fog outside. "We've reviewed the preliminary evidence," the DA began, setting a thick file on the table. "If witness accounts hold, and the video corroborates the skirt-lifting incident, we have grounds for misdemeanor assault, public indecency, and abuse of power." Helen spoke calmly but firmly. "If there's probable cause, we pursue charges. We do this clean. No favors, no shortcuts." Vega nodded in agreement. "And the department will cooperate fully with the investigation. Full transparency." The DA leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Prepare for backlash. The union won't take this quietly. But the law is the law. If it happened the way it appears, charges will be filed by week's end." The path ahead was clear, and it would not be easy. That evening, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the council chambers, the first emergency session in months was called to order. The tension was immediate. Half the council members sat stiff, jaws clenched, eyes darting toward the cameras positioned in the back. The other half leaned in, voices sharp, ready for a fight they had seen coming for years. Mayor Brooks opened the session with a voice that didn't ask for permission. She laid out the facts. The assault at Lakeview Park, the pattern of complaints against Officer Lasky, the failure of the internal review processes to protect the public. Her words didn't tremble. They sliced through the chamber with the weight of undeniable truth. "We are not here to debate whether misconduct happened," she said. "We are here to decide what we will do about it." Councilman Reeves, a graying moderate who had long walked the line between reform and loyalty to the badge, spoke first. "Madam Mayor, with respect, if we start publicly disciplining officers based on unproven accusations, we risk undermining the trust between law enforcement and our citizens." Helen's reply was immediate. "Councilman, what undermines trust is when citizens fear those sworn to protect them. What undermines trust is decades of silence. We've protected reputations while sacrificing safety. That ends now." Councilwoman Dorsey, the youngest on the council, and one of the few who had grown up on the city's west side, spoke up next. Silence. She raised her voice, saying, "This is my silence. I was pretending this is new. How many more women need to get hurt before we stop covering for cowards?" The room shifted. Sides were being drawn, not along party lines, but along the lines of truth and denial. After hours of tense debate, the council voted on an emergency motion, temporary oversight of the police department by an independent civilian board, mandatory review of all use-of-force incidents within the past 5 years, and a requirement for body-worn cameras to be activated at all times during public interactions. The motion passed by a single vote. Word of the council's decision spread through the streets before the meeting even adjourned. The next morning, protesters gathered outside the police station downtown, their signs cut through the humid summer air. Believe her. Protect, don't harass. Justice for Nia. But it wasn't just Nia they marched for. It was every girl who had walked home with keys between her fingers, every mother who taught her daughter how to survive a traffic stop, every person who had learned to brace for injustice and call it normal. The streets rang with chants, sharp and clear against the walls of a city that could no longer look away. And inside her office, Helen watched from the window, heart heavy but resolute. This was only the beginning. Later that afternoon, Mayor Brooks stood before the press on the steps of City Hall, framed not by flags or campaign banners, but by a sea of concerned citizens. Some were allies, others were skeptics, waiting for her to fail. She didn't speak with flash. She spoke with clarity. Effective immediately, she announced, the city is implementing the following temporary reforms, pending the outcome of this investigation. She raised her hand and counted each measure aloud. All officers engaged in public-facing duties will wear body cameras activated at all times. Civilian oversight will monitor all misconduct investigations in real time. And we are fast-tracking the review of disciplinary cases that have remained unresolved for more than 90 days. This is a return to accountability. The crowd outside the building reacted in waves, some relieved, some skeptical, others simply stunned at such changes could come this fast. Across town, at the police union headquarters, phones rang off the hook. Statements were being drafted. Quiet meetings were scheduled with attorneys and PR consultants. The backlash was coming. They just hadn't decided yet how loud it would be. But outside the precinct, the protests kept growing. By sunset, hundreds of people filled the streets. Some held candles, others carried signs. The chant that rose through the night was simple and steady. Protect us, don't harass us. Nia watched the footage from her small apartment, curled on the couch, her phone buzzing every few seconds. She still hadn't answered half the messages. Some of them she didn't have the strength to read yet. Jordan knocked on her door, letting himself in without waiting. "You eating anything yet?" he asked, setting down a takeout bag on the counter. Nia gave a tired smile. "I'll try." He sat beside her, watching the news scroll across the screen. "This is bigger than you, now." She nodded. She knew it was. That was what terrified her, and what fueled her. The reporter on the screen announced the city's next steps: open forums for public testimony, additional audits of past patrol stops, and a hotline for misconduct reports. It was a start, a small one, but it was something. Down at the precinct, Deputy Chief Vega stood alone in the records room, surrounded by stacks of forgotten files. She flipped open another complaint, 5 years old, dismissed without a single interview. She marked it for review and kept going. The work wouldn't stop just because the press conferences did. It would take months, maybe years, to undo what had been built on silence. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the city felt like it was moving in the right direction. And on the other side of the window, where the night breeze carried the sound of chanting voices, Nia Brooks closed her eyes, let herself breathe, and prepared for the fight still ahead. The district attorney stood beneath the courthouse rotunda, the marble columns framing him like a stage set for justice. Reporters packed the stairs, microphones jutting forward, cameras trained on his every word. The city had waited days for this moment. Now there was no turning back. A thorough review of the evidence. The DA began, voice steady but sharp, including video footage, eyewitness accounts, and prior misconduct complaints. We are formally filing criminal charges against Officer Raymond Lasky and Officer Dean Carter. He paused, letting the weight settle. Officer Lasky will be charged with 3 counts: misdemeanor assault, abuse of official capacity, and public sexual harassment. Officer Carter will face 1 count of willful failure to intervene in the commission and the unlawful conduct. Gasp rippled through the gathered press. Somewhere near the back, a protester shouted, "Finally!" before being gently hushed by the crowd. This was not the moment for celebration. It was the first step in a much longer fight. The DA continued, "Let me be clear. No badge, no uniform, no title places a person above the law. This prosecution is about justice, not politics." He stepped back from the podium as reporters hurled questions. Will there be more charges? Is this the beginning of broader department reforms? Will the mayor's office be involved in the prosecution? The DA raised a hand to quiet the frenzy. This is an independent criminal case. Politics has no place in the courtroom. And with that, he walked away, leaving the city to absorb the weight of his words. Inside the police department, the backlash was immediate. In the locker rooms and briefing halls, the mood was fractured. Some officers slammed lockers shut in frustration, muttering about betrayal and political scapegoating. Others exchanged quiet glances, knowing too well that the silence around Lasky's behavior had lasted far too long. Sergeant Morales, a 20-year veteran, stood before his morning patrol squad and spoke plainly. "This hurts because it should. We let this rot grow inside our ranks. Now we have to clean it out." Not everyone agreed, but no one could deny it anymore. That afternoon, the county booking office released Lasky's mugshot. His face, once smug with untouchable arrogance, now bore the thin cracks of a man cornered. He tried to look defiant, jaw tight, shoulders squared, but in his eyes, the fear was clear. Carter's booking was quieter, less publicized. He didn't fight the process. He didn't posture for the cameras. He simply turned himself in, a young man already drowning in regret. The images flooded local news channels. Across the city, screens flickered with the faces of 2 men who once carried power like armor, and now wore it like chains. The message was clear. For the first time in a long time, the badge wasn't enough to shield them from accountability. At home, Nia watched the mugshots flash across her television screen, her stomach twisted, not from satisfaction, but from the sheer surreal weight of it all. Just days ago, she had been reading quietly on a park bench. Now the entire city was watching her story unfold. She hadn't asked for this spotlight, but it found her anyway. Her phone buzzed with new notifications. Invitations to speak at forums, community panels, and student rallies poured in from across the city. People wanted to hear from her. They wanted her voice, her story, her presence. But each request felt heavier than the last. She wasn't sure if she was ready to carry that weight. Jordan dropped by again that evening, his usual mix of humor and concern filling the small apartment. "You gonna answer any of those invites?" he asked gently, setting down a grocery bag filled with tea and snacks. "I don't know," Nia admitted, rubbing her temples. "I didn't do this for speeches or headlines. I just didn't want to be erased." Jordan sat beside her, thoughtful. Sometimes the people who never wanted the spotlight end up shining the brightest in it. She offered a faint smile, but it didn't erase the exhaustion in her eyes. The next morning, Nia walked into Empower Forward, the small nonprofit where she volunteered part-time. It was normally a quiet place, tucked away in an aging brick building on the west side, but today it buzzed with life. People were already waiting by the door. Young women, mothers, college students, Even a few men holding stories they hadn't dared share until now. The director of the nonprofit, a woman named Alicia, greeted Nia with a hug and a quiet smile. "They've been coming since the news broke," Alicia whispered. "Some of them never filed complaints. Some tried and no one listened. They see you, Nia, and now they want to be heard too." Nia swallowed hard, feeling the lump rise in her throat. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't even sure she was strong enough for this, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. She spent the rest of the afternoon listening. No speeches, no camera crews, just quiet, heavy conversations filled with pain, fear, and finally, hope. Meanwhile, outside the city limits, the story had begun to spread beyond local news. National outlets picked it up, framing Nia as a reluctant symbol of resistance. Headlines read, "Mayor's Daughter Sparks Recognizing in Police Department," and "Park Harassment Ignites City-wide Protest." They called her a leader, a catalyst, a movement starter. But in her heart, Nia was still just the girl on the park bench who wanted to read in peace. And now, peace was the one thing she couldn't find. As the week wore on, the story refused to fade. National media outlets dispatched crews to Lakeview Park, where the quiet wooden bench became a backdrop for nightly news segments. Cable anchors debated the meaning of the moment, some praising Nia's courage, others questioning whether it was right to prosecute officers over what they called a lapse in judgment. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Justice for Nia" and "End Abuse of Power," sparking conversations that reached far beyond the city limits. Nia tried to tune it out, but the noise found its way in anyway. Every grocery store, every coffee shop, every bus stop seemed to echo her name. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a story, a headline, a symbol, and yet, when she looked in the mirror, all she saw was a woman trying to make it to tomorrow without breaking under the weight of it all. At Empower Forward, the calls kept coming. Survivors from other cities, some who had never spoken a word until now, reached out through emails and late-night voicemails. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. Power misused, voices silenced, dignity stolen in moments that were supposed to be safe. Alicia approached Nia one afternoon with a suggestion. "You don't have to carry this alone. Why don't we hold a listening session? A private one. No cameras, no press, just survivors. Let them speak. Let them heal together." Nia hesitated. The thought of reliving her story in a room full of strangers made her chest tighten. But then she remembered how alone she had felt sitting on that bench. How powerless she had felt in that moment of violation. Maybe it didn't have to be that way for them. "Oh," Nia said softly, "let's do it." Word spread quietly, and within 2 days, the small community room at Empower Forward filled with people. Women of every age, background, and story. Some spoke in whispers. Others, we wept as they spoke for the first time in years. And for once, no one interrupted. No one doubted them. They were believed. Nia didn't say much that day. She listened. She cried. And when it was her turn to speak, she kept it simple. "You are not alone. You were never alone." Across the city, the police department wrestled with its growing fracture. Officers who once backed Lasky without question now whispered doubts in the locker rooms. Others, furious at the charges, doubled down on their loyalty to the badge, calling the investigation a witch hunt. The tension was thick, unavoidable. The department was split between those who wanted change and those who wanted silence. But the one truth no one could ignore was this: the silence had been shattered. And whether the city was ready or not, the reckoning had begun. The courthouse doors opened at 8 o'clock. But by then, a crowd had already formed. Some held signs, others just carried quiet determination. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Press lined the back rows, survivors sat near the front, and police officers, both silent supporters and silent critics, filled the sides. You could feel the tension in the air like a storm waiting to break. Judge Ramirez took the bench, gavel striking once to call the court to order. A quiet hush fell across the room. The prosecution wasted no time. Within minutes, they wheeled in a flat-screen monitor and played the video, the one that had started it all. The footage was shaky, recorded on a teenager's phone from across the path, but what it captured was unmistakable. The image of Officer Lasky lifting Naya's skirt with his baton, the cruel laughter that followed. No dramatic music, no need for explanation. The room itself absorbed the truth. The prosecution called their first witnesses. The veteran from the park spoke first, voice steady but firm. He was just sitting there, reading. That man, he pointed at Lasky, without hesitation, treated her like she didn't matter, like she was nothing. Next came the young mother, her toddler now asleep in the gallery behind her. He laughed when he did it, she said, tears threatening her voice but not her conviction. I've never seen anything like it, and I don't want my son to grow up thinking that's normal. Each testimony added weight to the case. By the time the prosecution rested, the entire room felt heavy with the reality of what had been exposed. Then it was Nia's turn. She rose from her seat and walked to the witness stand, each step calm, measured. She took the oath without hesitation and sat tall, facing the courtroom that now held its breath. The prosecutor approached gently, as if acknowledging the weight Nia already carried. Miss Brooks, can you tell us what happened that day in your own words? Nia took a quiet breath. Her voice was steady, clear, and strong. I was sitting in the park, reading a book. I wasn't breaking any law. I wasn't disturbing anyone. I was simply existing, and for that, I was treated like a threat, like a thing, like I didn't deserve to be left alone in peace. Her words hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. She continued, speaking not just about the moment itself, but about what it meant. He lifted my skirt. He didn't just violate my privacy. He tried to erase my dignity. But what he didn't count on, what they never count on, is that some of us refuse to disappear. The courtroom stayed silent, not out of shock, but out of reverence. For once, everyone listened. When Nia stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom exhaled as one. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier, something closer to reckoning. Even the defense attorney paused before speaking, adjusting his tie as if stalling for time. He rose slowly and addressed the jury. His voice was practiced, his tone calm, but the weight of the video footage and witness testimony lingered like smoke in the air. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, Officer Lasco is not a monster. He is a man who has spent years protecting this city. Yes, his actions that day were inappropriate, but let us not confuse a lapse in judgment with a lifetime of service. He was under stress, facing pressures most of us could never imagine. Should we define a man by one mistake? But the argument felt thin, hollow, because no matter how many words he used, the video spoke louder. Then came Lasky's own testimony. He took the stand with a defiant posture, chin raised, trying to maintain the bravado that had shielded him for years. But his answers lacked conviction. I didn't mean anything by it, he claimed. It was a joke. I didn't hurt anyone. The prosecutor didn't let it slide. Officer Lasky, would you consider it a joke if someone lifted your daughter's skirt in a public park? The question hung in the air like a hammer. Lasky's face twitched, but he said nothing. And then, at last, it was Carter's turn. The younger officer approached the stand, his shoulders tense, his voice shaking slightly. Unlike Lasky, Carter didn't posture. He didn't deflect. He simply told the truth. I knew it was wrong, Carter admitted, voice cracking. I saw it happening, and I froze. I didn't stop it. I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. I was afraid. Afraid of him, afraid of what it would mean to call it out. The courtroom was still. And now? The prosecutor asked softly. Carter swallowed hard, meeting Nia's gaze across the room. Now I know silence is just as dangerous as action. I should have stopped him. I should have protected her, and I'll carry that failure for the rest of my life." Somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled sharply, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight Carter carried. The defense tried to soften the damage, pointing to Carter's rookie status, his lack of experience, but the truth was too clear, too raw to be washed away. When both sides rested, the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations. The room emptied, leaving behind only the quiet hum of tension, waiting for what would come next. Outside, a crowd had gathered once again, signs in hand, hearts in their throats, waiting for the verdict that would echo far beyond the walls of that courthouse. Hours passed, the courthouse halls filled with whispers and nervous pacing. Nia sat beside her mother in a quiet corner of the lobby, her hands folded, her mind racing, yet calm. Mayor Brooks kept a steady presence beside her, offering silent strength when words felt too small. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, the tension returned, thick and suffocating. Everyone rose as Judge Ramirez re-entered. The jury filed in, faces unreadable, holding the decision that would define the next chapter of the city's story. The judge turned to the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, voice steady but not cold. "We have, Your Honor." The room stilled. In the case of the People versus Officer Raymond Lasky on the charge of misdemeanor assault, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple of gasps swept through the room, followed by an eerie silence. The charge of abuse of official capacity. We find the defendant guilty. Lasky stared ahead, his jaw clenched, but a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. And on the charge of public sexual harassment, we find the defendant guilty. The silence broke outside the courtroom as the news was relayed in hurried whispers and urgent text messages. The crowd beyond the doors erupted in a mix of cheers and tears. The judge turned to the second defendant. In the case of the People versus Officer Dean Carter on the charge of willful failure to intervene, we find the defendant guilty. Carter bowed his head, accepting the verdict with quiet resignation. The courtroom sat frozen for a moment longer before Judge Ramirez spoke. "Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck once, and just like that, the weight of weeks of testimony and decades of silence cracked open. Nia stayed seated as people around her gathered their things and filed out. She wasn't rushing to celebrate. This wasn't joy. It was justice. But justice had never been cleaned. It was messy, complicated, and often painful. She looked across the courtroom at Carter. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in her gaze, only clarity. He had made his choices. Now, so had the jury. Mayor Brooks gently touched Nia's shoulder. "You ready to go?" Nia stood slowly, taking one last look around the room, at the witnesses who had stood beside her, at the faces of the jury who had finally listened, at the place where she had told her truth and been believed. She said quietly, "I'm ready." As they walked toward the exit, the doors opened to a flood of light, and the hum of hundreds waiting outside. Reporters shouted questions, supporters raised signs, and through it all, Nia walked forward. Not as a victim, as a survivor. And the fight was far from over. The sentencing hearing drew a crowd even larger than the trial. Reporters packed the courtroom aisles. Survivors sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, and city officials lined the back wall in silent witness. For many, this was the moment they had waited for, the line where justice and consequence finally met. When the judge called for victim impact statements, the room fell into a hush so deep it felt sacred. Nia stood, steady despite the weight of the moment, and walked slowly to the podium. She placed her hands gently on either side, took a breath, and spoke. "He lifted my skirt that day. He wasn't just mocking me. He was erasing me. He wanted to humiliate me into silence. But here I stand, and I refuse to disappear." Her voice didn't shake, it carried. "I thought I would go home ashamed. Instead, I walked into this courtroom. He thought I would shrink. Instead, I rose, and today I want him, and every officer who has ever abused their power, to hear this. Your actions do not define my voice. Your cruelty does not silence my voice, and your uniform does not protect you from accountability. Somewhere in the back, a quiet sob broke the silence, followed by the soft exhale of those who finally felt seen. Nia continued, "This city deserves officers who protect, not prey. Girls deserve to sit in a park without fear. Women deserve dignity, not dismissal. And we all deserve a justice system that defends the powerless, not just the powerful." When she finished, she stepped back, her presence filling the room with something far larger than fear, something closer to truth. Judge Ramirez nodded solemnly, then turned to Lasky. "Mr. Lasky, your actions were not a lapse in judgment. They were a deliberate abuse of authority. You used your badge as a weapon, and today you face the consequences of that choice." The judge listed the sentence, each word firm and unflinching. 18 months in county detention for misdemeanor assault, 12 months probation following release, a 5-year ban from public service, mandatory completion of behavioral correction and ethics training. Lasky stood rigid, his jaw locked, but there was no swagger left in his posture. For the first time, the weight of his choices sat on his shoulders, visible for all to see. The gavel fell, sharp and final. Court was adjourned. But outside those walls, the real reckoning was only beginning. The verdict sent ripples through the city. Some celebrated in the streets, holding signs and lighting candles. Others grumbled behind closed doors, claiming the justice system had gone too far. But whether they cheered or resisted, one truth rang clear. The era of silence was over. In the days following the sentencing, the city vibrated with change and resistance in equal measure. Mayor Brooks wasted no time. She convened emergency meetings with Deputy Chief Vega and the city's legal advisors to dismantle the very systems that had protected officers like Lasky for far too long. Their first order of business: overhauling the Internal Affairs Division. Vega reassigned leadership, replacing long-time insiders with independent investigators, some of whom had previously worked in civil rights law. New protocols required that all misconduct complaints involving public harassment or abuse of power be reviewed by an external oversight committee before dismissal. Next came the patrol review logs. Every officer's stop history, body camera footage, and complaint record were pulled for audit. Vega's team worked around the clock, combing through years of ignored misconduct reports. The results were sobering. It wasn't just Lasky, there were others. Officers whose names appeared again and again in complaints dismissed with a single sentence: insufficient evidence. Mayor Brooks stood before the city council with these findings and didn't sugarcoat them. "We failed our citizen," she said plainly, "and it will take years to repair that trust. But today, we begin. We will rebuild a department that protects the people, not itself." Not everyone agreed. The police union held a press conference 2 days later, their spokesman calling the reforms an overreach driven by political ambition. They warned of low morale, recruiting challenges, and what they described as a chilling effect on policing. But outside City Hall, the mood was different. People gathered with candles, not signs, standing quietly in a vigil for those who had suffered in silence. They didn't chant. They didn't argue. They stood together because sometimes the loudest statement is refusing to leave. In the midst of it all, Nia took a quiet step toward her own healing. On a cool Sunday morning, she returned to Lakeview Park for the first time since the attack. She wore the same navy skirt, not as a reminder of what was taken from her, but as a reclamation of her space. The park was quiet again. Birdsong drifted through the air, and sunlight filtered through the moss-draped oaks. She sat on the same weathered bench, this time without fear. A few people recognized her, nodded in quiet solidarity, but gave her space. She opened a new book, let the breeze turn the first few pages, and allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't closure, it wasn't victory, but it was hers. And in that quiet, something that had been broken inside her began to heal. The bench, the trees, the sunlight, it all belonged to her again. No one could take that away. That evening, as twilight settled over the city, Nia sat by her apartment window, looking out over the streets she knew so well. The quiet hum of life below, the cars passing, neighbors chatting, children laughing, felt distant but grounding. Her phone buzzed beside her, notifications piling up as new articles published and interview requests poured in. But she left them unanswered for now. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Her mother knocked gently on the doorframe, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to Nia and sat beside her without saying a word at first. They watched the city lights blink on, one by one, street by street. "You changed something, you know," Helen said softly. Nia gave a tired smile. "Feels like I just stirred the hornet's nest." Helen chuckled faintly. "Sometimes stirring it is the only way to build something new." They sat in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for explanation. Nia's mind drifted to the faces of the women she met at Empower Forward, the ones who shared their stories in whispers and in sobs. She thought of Carter's shaking voice on the witness stand, of Vega's quiet resolve in the face of backlash, of the little girls in the crowd who watched her with wide eyes as if seeing their own futures written in her courage. This wasn't about a single bench in a single park. It was about every quiet injustice that never made the news. Every moment someone swallowed their fear and said nothing because they thought no one would listen. But they were listening now. And that meant her work wasn't done. Tomorrow she would return to Empower Forward and help plan the next community listening session. She'd meet with the legal team drafting new accountability measures. She'd sit with survivors and let them know they weren't alone. But tonight she allowed herself to rest, to feel the weight of what she'd carried and the lightness of what she'd reclaimed. As the wind rustled the leaves outside, she whispered to herself, soft but sure, "I'm still here." It was a promise, to herself, to the city, to every person still waiting to be seen. Across town, Deputy Chief Vega finalized the next round of department reforms. At City Hall, Mayor Brooks prepared to announce a task force to address racial profiling and misconduct. The city was moving, slowly but surely, toward something better. And in Lakeview Park, beneath the quiet oaks, the bench sat empty again. Not forgotten, just waiting for whoever needed it next. It started with a single room. Nia and the team at Empower Forward called it a truth room. No microphones, no cameras, just folding chairs in a church basement and the promise of safety. It was a space where survivors could speak freely, whether to share their stories or simply sit in silence among people who understood. The first session drew 10 people. By the second week, 25. Word spread quietly, like whispers breaking through long-held fear. What happened in those rooms wasn't loud, but it was powerful. People who had carried their pain alone for years finally spoke it aloud and realized they weren't alone anymore. Nia didn't lead every session. She didn't need to. Survivors led themselves, and that was the point. Among those who found her voice was Kiara. Kiara was 24, soft-spoken but sharp, with a memory that held more scars than her years should have allowed. She had been stopped by a Fazurka Lasky 3 years before, during a routine traffic stop. What happened to her never made the news. She filed a complaint. Nothing came of it. No follow-up, no investigation, just silence. But after seeing Nia stand on that courthouse floor, Kiara found something she thought she'd lost forever: courage. At the 4th Truth Room session, Kiara stood up, voice shaking but strong, and told her story. She described the night she was pulled over, how Lascasi searched her car without cause, how his words cut sharper than any weapon, how she was left on the side of the road in tears, doubting whether anyone would ever believe her. That night, her story spread across social media, shared by allies and activists who had been following the trial. Local reporters picked it up, and soon, 6 more women came forward with eerily similar stories. Deputy Chief Vega opened new investigations before sunrise. Each case peeled back another layer of the department's dysfunction. Each voice added another crack in the wall of silence that had protected bad cops for decades. And still, the calls didn't stop. Nia sat in the Empower Forward office long after sunset, scrolling through emails from survivors across the state. Rural towns, inner-city blocks, college campuses. The patterns were undeniable. It was bigger than one city, bigger than one department. So, they expanded. With the help of community leaders and pro bono legal teams, Empower Forward announced its first statewide initiative, expanding the Truth Rooms project into counties that had never seen this kind of outreach before. They opened satellite offices, trained new volunteers, and partnered with local churches, schools, and libraries to provide safe spaces wherever they were needed. What started as a response to one act of violence had become a movement for every quiet voice still waiting to be heard. And in the quiet hours of those first new sessions, Nia sat at the back, notebook in hand, listening as the walls began to fall. As the Truth Room spread, invitations began pouring into Nia's inbox. Some were local panels. Others were statewide summits on justice and reform. But one stood out among them all: an invitation to deliver the keynote address at the State Leadership Summit on Public Integrity, an annual gathering of lawmakers, judges, and law enforcement leaders. At first, Nia hesitated. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a lawyer. She was just a young woman who spoke because silence wasn't an option. But Alicia, the Empower Forward director, encouraged her to go. "Your story didn't start with a microphone," Alicia said gently. "But maybe it can help change what people do with theirs." So, on a crisp autumn morning, Nia walked into the marble halls of the state capitol. She wore no flashy colors, no prepared slogans, just a navy blazer, a white wire, and a quiet fire that refused to burn out. As she stepped onto the stage, hundreds of eyes turned toward her, some skeptical, some curious, a few supportive. She adjusted the microphone and began. "I was taught to respect authority. But what do you do when authority doesn't respect you?" The room stilled. "I'm not here today to make anyone feel comfortable," she continued. "Comfort was never a promise in the pursuit of justice. Courage isn't about speeches and cameras. It's about showing up, about staying when it's hard, about telling the truth when no one wants to hear it." She told them about the park, about the baton, about the courtroom. But more than that, she told them about the women who sat in folding chairs in borrowed church basements, telling their truths in whispers and tears. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people whose stories never reach your desks." When she finished, there was no applause at first, just silence, deep, reflective silence. And then, one by one, people began to rise. Not a standing ovation for show, a recognition of truth. Later that afternoon, as she left the summit, an aide from the U.S. Department of Justice approached her quietly. "We've been watching what's happening in your city," the aide said. "The patterns are clear. The silence is systemic. The department is preparing to open a civil rights investigation into your police department. We'll be in touch soon." Nia thanked her, heart pounding but steady. It was happening. The story that began on a quiet park bench had now reached the highest levels of federal oversight. And for the first time, the system that silenced so many was finally being forced to answer. News of the federal civil rights investigation broke just days later. Headlines splashed across television screens and social media feeds. DOJ probes systemic misconduct in city police department. The mayor's office issued a statement welcoming the investigation. Deputy Chief Vega publicly pledged full cooperation, and the police union, caught off guard, scrambled to control the narrative. But the truth was out, and no press release could put it back. For Nia, the investigation wasn't the finish line. It was the next chapter. At Empower Forward, they expanded their hotline hours, added more legal volunteers, and created digital intake forms so survivors from even the most remote corners of the state could share their stories safely. One afternoon, Kiara stopped by the main office, a nervous smile on her face. "They want me to speak at the next city council session," she said quietly, "about what happened to me." Nia set down her papers and gave her a smile full of pride. "You ready?" Kiara hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." At the council session, Kiara stood tall behind the podium, hands shaking but voice clear. 3 years. I thought no one cared about what happened to me. But now I know. Silence doesn't mean we don't exist. It means we're still waiting to be heard. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, and then, one by one, members of the council nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply listened. For once, really listened. Afterward, as Kiara stepped down, dozens of women and men approached her, with quiet thanks and tearful hugs. Her courage had opened another door, and behind it countless others waited to step through. Meanwhile, Empower Forward finalized plans to expand statewide. New truth rooms were being planned in rural counties, university towns, and underserved neighborhoods. What had started as a single basement room was now a growing network of safe spaces across the state. But with the growth came backlash. A small group of local officials criticized the DOJ investigation as federal overreach. Conservative commentators painted Nia as a political puppet. Threats began trickling into Empower Forward's inbox, anonymous, angry, and designed to intimidate. Nia read them, then archived them. She wasn't going anywhere. One night, after another long day of calls and planning sessions, she stood once again in Lakeview Park. The moonlight cast long shadows over the path where it all began. She sat on the same bench, letting the quiet wrap around her like armor. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from an unknown number. "Because of you, I spoke today. Thank you." She smiled, tears stinging her eyes but not falling. The work wasn't finished. The battle wasn't over. But neither was she. She sat back, closed her eyes, and let the wind carry away the last traces of fear. Tomorrow, they would build again. Together. It didn't take long for the backlash to find Nia. Conservative media outlets painted her as a threat to law enforcement, accusing her of waging a war on police morale. Op-eds in the local paper called her a symbol of division, a puppet of political forces seeking to tear down the badge. Some politicians, eager to protect their image with law enforcement donors, publicly questioned her motives. But Nia didn't flinch. She knew the pattern. When people exposed uncomfortable truths, the first response was always to attack the messenger. Still, the noise wasn't easy to bear. Online harassment flooded her inbox. Anonymous voicemails called her names she wouldn't repeat. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the faces in those truth rooms, survivors who spoke for the first time. Girls who sat taller because they finally saw someone who looked like them, refusing to back down. And then came Mariah. Mariah was 17, from a rural town 2 hours outside the city. Her voice first appeared as a timid email in Empower Forward's inbox. She had been harassed by 2 local deputies during a late-night traffic stop. Alone, scared, and dismissed when she tried to file a complaint. Nia met her in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, away from reporters and cameras. Mariah sat with her hands clenched in her lap, voice barely a whisper. "What if no one believes me?" she asked. Nia reached across the table, her voice soft but sure. "I do, and you're not alone." That conversation sparked something bigger than either of them expected. Nia helped Mariah connect with a legal advocate and guided her through the process of filing a local church. Empower Forward partnered with a local church to open a truth room in Mariah's town. creating a space where other survivors came forward, some for the first time in their lives. Mariah spoke at the first session. Her voice trembled, but her message was clear. "I thought my story didn't matter, but I see now, it does, and so do yours." Word spread fast. What started as one girl's story ignited a movement in the rural counties, where misconduct had long gone unchecked. Back in the city, progress moved slowly but steadily. The city council passed sweeping internal reforms, including the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with real investigative power. New policies required every misconduct complaint to be publicly reported within 60 days. Officers now underwent mandatory trauma-informed training on bias, de-escalation, and the history of community monoliths relation. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was a start. Deputy Chief Vega led the implementation, navigating backlash from within the department and pressure from outside forces. She knew what was coming. Change never arrived without a fight. But neither had they. Inside the department, Deputy Chief Vega pushed deeper. What began as a review of Lasky's personnel file had grown into a full-scale audit. Her team uncovered complaint after complaint, most filed by Black women and young people of color. Some had been closed without investigation. Others had been lost in bureaucratic limbo. A few had been deliberately buried. Vega sat alone one evening, scrolling through the oldest cases. The patterns were undeniable. It wasn't just Lasky. Other names surfaced repeatedly. Officers with spotless public records, but dark histories behind the batch. She called a late-night meeting with Mayor Brooks. "We're looking at a systemic failure, Helen," Vega said plainly. "This isn't a few bad actors. This is a culture problem." Mayor Brooks nodded, the weight of it all pressing on her shoulders. "Then we don't stop with policy," she said. "We change the culture." Together they mapped out the next wave of reforms: anonymous complaint hotlines staffed by third parties, civilian ride-alongs to observe police interactions, quarterly public forums where the department would answer directly to the community. It was radical by some standards, but to them, it was the bare minimum. And while the political winds shifted, Naya kept moving. She continued mentoring Mariah, checking in weekly. She spoke at community colleges, youth centers, and faith gathering, sharing her story not as a victim, but as someone who refused to let her story end in silence. Everywhere she went, she reminded people that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing anyway. Meanwhile, the pushback grew louder. A state senator introduced a bill aimed at limiting the power of civilian oversight boards, calling them dangerous to law enforcement morale. Conservative talk shows blasted Nia by name, accusing her of manufacturing a crisis for political gain. Anonymous flyers appeared in some neighborhoods, warning residents that anti-radicals respectals were taking over the city. But what they didn't understand was that the movement had already rooted itself too deeply to be pulled out by fear. At the next city council meeting, Naya stood before the mic once again. "You can call us radicals, you can call us dangerous, but what we are, what we've always been, are survivors who refuse to stay silent. And if standing up for dignity and accountability makes us dangerous, then maybe the danger was the silence you've protected for far too long." The room went still. And then, applause broke out. Not polite applause. Not political applause. It was the sound of people who had been waiting to be heard. And now they were. In the quiet after the storm, Naya found herself back at City Hall, sitting across from her mother in the mayor's private office. The room was quiet, save for the hum of late-night traffic outside the window. Helen Brooks, for once, looked tired. Not defeated, never that, but tired in the way only those who fight long battles can be. She set her glasses down and leaned back. "Did you ever imagine it would come to this?" Helen asked. Nia gave a faint smile, half weary, half proud. "No, but maybe it always had to." They sat in that space for a while, letting the reality settle between them. The victories, the losses, the costs. "You lost a lot to get here," Helen said gently. "Privacy, peace, some days, maybe even joy." Nia looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkness. "And we gained something too. We made space for people to be believed, for people to speak, for girls like Mariah to fight without feeling alone." Helen nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Legacy isn't the trophies they give you when it's over. It's the change that stays after you're gone." Nia let those words linger in the air. She wasn't sure where her story would end, but she knew it wouldn't end here. Across town, Vega's audit team finalized a report that detailed 23 cases of misconduct previously swept under the rug. Some cases were reopened, others led to resignations before charges could be filed. And still, the work continued. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first public meeting. Dozens attended, some angry, some hopeful, all watching to see if this new system would hold. For the first time in years, officers sat across from citizens not as adversaries, but as people accountable to the same truth. And in rural towns, thanks to the truth rooms and Empower Forward's outreach, young survivors like Mariah began forming peer support circles, safe spaces where girls and young women shared their fears and victories without judgment. Late one Sunday afternoon, Nia visited one of those gatherings in Mariah's town. The church basement was warm, filled with nervous laughter and quiet determination. Mariah stood at the front, welcoming new faces, leading the meeting with a confidence Nia barely recognized from that first coffee shop conversation. Afterward, Mariah found her in the corner. "Think we're making a difference?" she asked. Nia smiled, tears filling her eyes but not falling. "I know we are." As she drove home under a sky thick with stars, Nia allowed herself one moment of peace. The battle wasn't over. The work wasn't done. But the movement was alive, and it was no longer hers alone to carry. It belonged to all of them now. It was a warm afternoon when Nia returned to Lakeview Park. Not alone this time, but surrounded by voices that had once been silent. The old bench still stood beneath the moss-draped trees, but the space felt different now. Not haunted, not broken, just Yara was there, sitting cross-legged in the grass, laughing with Mariah, who wore a "We Believe Survivors" pin on her jacket. Several women from the truth rooms joined them, some who had testified, others who had simply listened, but all of them standing taller than when they first walked through the doors. They brought food, fruit trays, sandwiches, a cheap cake with the words "Still Here" written in purple icing. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense. No speeches, no cameras, but it was joyful, and for once, joy didn't feel like defiance. It felt like healing. Nia sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap, listening as conversations blossomed around her. Someone played music from a portable speaker. Children ran between trees. At one point, Kiara plopped down beside her and nudged her shoulder. "Do you ever just stop and realize what you've done?" she asked. Nia smiled, eyes watching the canopy above. "Sometimes," she said, "but mostly I think about what's next." Mariah joined them a few minutes later, handing out iced tea she'd picked up on the way. They clinked the plastic cups together without ceremony, like a quiet toast to everything unspoken between them. Survival, courage, the cost of telling the truth. As the sun lowered in the sky, casting golden light over the grass, Nia felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp edge of justice or the weight of duty, something simpler. Peace. They stayed for hours. When the light finally faded and people began packing up, no one rushed to leave. No one lingered out of fear. It was just a good day in a park that once held something much darker. Before they left, Nia stood and looked at the bench one last time. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small folded card, and taped it to the underside of the wood. It read, "You are not alone." No signature. No date. Just that. Because someday, someone else might sit in that same spot, feeling the weight of a world that doesn't believe them. And maybe, just maybe, they'd feel less invisible. The bench wasn't just a place anymore. It was a beginning. And now, it belonged to more than her. A few weeks later, something new appeared downtown, on the side of an old brick building that once housed a forgotten municipal office. A mural stretched 2 stories tall. Bold strokes of color, deep blues, radiant golds, and warm earth tones framed the image of a young black woman standing strong, her fists at her side, her eyes forward. The likeness was unmistakable. It was Nia. But it wasn't the courtroom Nia, or the viral video Nia. It was the Nia from the park bench, the survivor, the fighter, the woman who stood when others tried to make her disappear. Below the mural, in script both delicate and fierce, were the words, "Silent." The artist, a local woman named Elena, who had been following the story since the beginning, posted a simple caption when she unveiled the work, "For every voice that refused to be silenced." People came from all over the city to stand beneath that mural. Some left notes, others left flowers, a few stood in quiet tears, letting the moment speak for itself. At first, Nia avoided going to see it. She didn't want to be treated like a symbol. She wasn't chasing fame, but eventually, late one evening, when the streets were quiet and the city was asleep, she walked downtown alone. She stood beneath her own painted image, feeling the weight of what it meant to be seen in such a way. A part of her still didn't recognize the woman on that wall, but another part of her, deeper and steadier, did. She traced the words beneath her feet and whispered softly, "For all of us." A few days later, the annual Empower Forward Summit filled a civic center to capacity. What had started as a small gathering in a borrowed church basement was now a statewide event, drawing activists, survivors, law enforcement leaders, and ordinary citizens committed to change. Nia stepped onto the stage, no script in hand, only the truth. "Justice is not a destination," she said, voice clear and steady. "It's a door, and we're walking through it together." The crowd rose to their feet, not because they were told to, but because they knew what those words meant. They were walking it too, step by step, story by story. Afterward, a young woman approached her backstage, barely older than Mariah, and handed her a folded note. Nia waited until the crowd had gone before opening it. In simple handwriting, it read, "Because of you, I spoke up." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her bag beside all the others. Each one a reminder that the work didn't end with a speech. It carried on in quiet acts of courage, every single day. And that was enough to keep going. As the seasons shifted from late summer into fall, Nia found herself drawn back to where it all began. Lakeview Park, quiet as ever, greeted her with the same gentle breeze and the rustling of leaves overhead. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. She walked along the gravel path, her steps slow but steady, until she reached the old weathered bench beneath the oaks. For a moment, she stood there, letting the memory of that day settle over her like a familiar coat. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, they were still there, part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She sat down, letting the wind tug gently at her hair, and as she looked out across the park, she smiled softly. This was still her city, her story, her fight. But she was no longer carrying it alone. Behind her, life moved on. Children laughed by the swings. A couple walked their dog along the water's edge. A young woman sat nearby reading a book, unbothered, free. This was what it was all for. Not the headlines, not the trials, but the ordinary moments of peace that should belong to everyone. A voice called out from the path behind her. She turned to see a young girl, maybe 10 years old, clutching a notebook. Her eyes were wide with recognition, but gentle with kindness. "Are you the lady from the mural?" the girl asked shyly. Nia smiled. "I am." Girl hesitated, then stepped closer. "Thank you for standing up. My mom said you helped people who were scared to speak." Nia's throat tightened, but she managed a warm smile. "Your mom's right, but now there are a lot of people standing up, not just me." The girl smiled back, her courage blooming. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Nia leaned down, her voice gentle but firm. "Be better than me. Start now." The girl nodded, her smile brightening the fading daylight, before running off to join her friends. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park, Nia let herself finally exhale. The fight wasn't over. New battles would come, new voices would rise, and systems would push back. But the cracks had already spread too far to be sealed again. And as long as there were people willing to speak, to listen, and to believe, change would keep coming. She stood from the bench, brushed the dust from her skirt, and looked once more at the place where her life changed forever. The wind carried her whispered promise into the evening air. "I'm still here." And she walked forward, steady, unbroken. Not alone. Not anymore.